All right, Saddam Hussein, welcome to the Jay Burden Show. How you doing?
I'm doing well, Mr. Burden. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, I'm glad to have you on. You've been in the chat for a while, and I'll be honest, I'd jump at any chance to talk to Saddam Hussein himself, right?
Well, being the reincarnation in the South, I intend to wage jihad on the GAE.
Fair enough. Am I right? Fair enough. All right, so you sent me a list of topics. It was actually pretty interesting, and one of the things you mentioned you want to talk about, because I mean, look, I grew up in the South, you grew up in the South, was revivals. So why don't you give a little bit of your background, just religiously, so we can have some kind of context for what you're about to say.
Right. So I grew up, like you said, in the South, North Carolina, born and raised. Pretty much Baptist my entire life. I've got some pretty interesting intergenerational faith stuff. My grandparents, they were Presbyterian. My great grandmother, she was Presbyterian, and she would always lambast my grandfather for. She said he'd go to hell because he was a Baptist, and only Presbyterians go to heaven. But yeah, I grew up most Baptist churches, pretty conservative. Um, 200 people tops. I mean, you rarely get any young folk in there, and it's mostly old people. But I fell away from the Baptist faith probably when I went to college a few years ago, and just recently I've started to get back into it. I'll be closer to a city, as time progresses, and try to find one of those more Southern Baptist convention oriented churches. But yeah, I've like I said, all the churches are very small usually. I mean, they were usually built in the early 1900s or late 1800s, and yeah, they have the typical organ and piano mixture. They usually have a choir in the back, just full of random people who think they can sing and do a fairly good job at it and have choir practice and all that. But I recently went to a New Age revival church for Father's Day. My stepfather, he was giving his testimony, and as soon as I walked in the church, I knew it was going to be weird because there were seats instead of pews, and it was in a newer building. They had two huge flat screens up on either side of the podium, and there were huge speakers, and they were playing some kind of little soft tempo music as soon as you walked in. So you get the feel. There's coffee in the back, and I get there and I'm dressed up for my Sunday best, and I look around and I look at my mother. And I'm like, I'm not too sure about this. So then they get going in the first. They do a countdown first, which I found was weird.
Yeah,
From
that
the
is really weird, actually. I've never heard of that before.
Yeah, they did a countdown. They had like these videos playing of just like a drone flying over a coastline somewhere, and with the 5 minute mark going, and then they do these three or four new age Christian songs, as you've mentioned that Mr. Hank Hill would mention makes Christianity worse, or makes rock and roll worse as opposed to Christianity better. And aside from those three songs, they were just singing, clapping, and people act like they're having a good time, but I don't know. It feels very hollow to bring all these new age hip hop, soft rock kind of stuff into the church without the hymn. They had no hymnals at all. So that's my main gripe against it. It feels very shallow and away from tradition.
So that's actually interesting. My experience was slightly different. So I grew up in with still am part of a fairly conservative Presbyterian denomination, but my grandparents, who I was largely spent a lot of time with as a kid, practically raised me, went to, just the big old, Southern Baptist mega churches, like in the middle of nowhere, Virginia, but still had, 400, 500 people. And so the experience was pretty much how you described. Like, it was very, to a certain degree, modern, in the sense that, like, it was lots of instruments. It was guitar, drums, big choir, big sound, and very charismatic. Like, they weren't quite. And sorry if you hear my cat in the background. He's in my bathroom, so he echoes. But it wasn't quite holy rolling, like speaking in tongues and stuff like that. It was about one step below that. So I have a certain amount of affection for those type of people, just because it's what I grew up with. But I know what you mean about it feeling hollow, and especially with like if people have ever been to non-denominational churches, or people shorten it to non-denom churches, where it was very much like that, right? Like it was weird because they're not in church buildings. And look, like even in most Protestant churches, which are kind of iconoclastic, there's still a lot of symbolism in the way a church is constructed, right? Like it's cruciform. It is designed to kind of put you in the space for worship. But a lot of these are in essentially like big aluminum buildings, like warehouses. And it's interesting you brought up the screens, because I actually agree. The screens are a relatively new phenomenon, just by virtue of the fact that it's relatively new tech. But it is very jarring not being used to it. So I'm curious, right? Because this is something I have a certain degree of affection for. You said when we were talking before the show that the churches you went to did a lot of like vacation Bible school stuff. I'm curious, what was your experience of that?
Um, I was really into Vacation Bible School when I was a young man. It was fun for what it was. I mean, um, you do the little arts and crafts thing, but as you got older, they just pretty much place you in a Bible study class, and you know, you wouldn't get to have fun, quote unquote. But I mean, you might get wrangled to deal with some of the younger kids, or watch them throw water balloons at each other, or give them popsicles or stuff like that. But a main part of the older kids was the music. I mean, because younger kids, I mean, they're not choreographed very well, needless to say. They might do a couple little hand motions, um, the what is it, the flat hand down the middle of the chest, meaning Christ, or salvation or something. That's about it, and they'll read the words off the screen and stuff. But I was really into it. I took the rock and roll Christian thing to a very high level. I grew out the long hair, and I would be headbanging in the back while everybody else was like singing. I still doing the motions, but I'd be doing that. And then the most the biggest point highlight in that was I was wearing some regular jeans and a flannel t-shirt or a flannel shirt, and we finished up, and I was standing at the front, and so then I do at the very end. I slide down on my knees, pretty much trying to emulate Steven Tyler or someone like that, and just like rock on, and everyone in church like just ecstatic. And but yeah, the vacation Bible schools, they always seem to be very weird because they always have to jump on a new theme. One year it's space, one year it's a jungle, next it's a desert, and so it's always like they're always trying to find some sense of adventure, I guess, to try to take you out of the tedium of domesticity that is a usual Baptist service.
Yeah, it's funny. I was talking about this on American Populist channel, but and I might have said it before, but honestly, I just think it's kind of funny. Did you ever go to church camp?
Yes, 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 yes.
So, and I might have said this story before. I have three stories and I repeat them. But I went. If you've ever seen the documentary Jesus Camp, I went to Jesus Camp as a kid several times, and I don't remember the themes of all of them. But one time, and this was still when George Bush was president, but we did uh, an army, like an armed forces themed church camp. So they broke us all in the teams, right? Because a lot of these camps, they have like a Harry Potter house system where it's a big competition, right? But they broke us up into the different branches of the art of the military, right? And had us like drill with pretend guns and stuff. It was ridiculous. Like it would have given like a New York Times reporter an aneurysm to watch us do it. But
Oh,
one of the other things, this might be so specific, I might be doxing myself. But have you ever gone to like an actual revival?
no, I've been to several Pentecostal churches, but never an actual full-scale revival.
So I'll be perfectly honest. I've only been to one Pentecostal church, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. Like I couldn't worship like that, but I mean everyone else seemed to be having a good time. So who am I to disagree with them, right? But so in my town, there are two big Baptist megachurches within the city limits, and a few others kind of outside of town. But the two big ones. One is associated with a school and very, very large, and the other one is just kind of independent. And both of them have essentially theatrical revivals. They're gonna scare the Jesus into you. So one of them is over the summer, and I've actually never been allowed to go because my parents were like, "What do you do? We're not letting you go there." But it is this massive undertaking with hundreds of volunteers. And the point of it is that, and these are oddly similar events, just with different tones, where they will take you on a guided tour through hell. And so the point is they're gonna scare the Jesus into you by essentially like taking a bunch of preteens through like like an acted diorama of hell. And it's not a small thing. Like it's hundreds of volunteers, and it takes like 45 minutes to an hour to go through. And I remember because I had friends who would like volunteer in it. They were like, "Oh yeah, it's really intense. Like we're yelling the entire time. Everyone's weeping. Everyone's crying. And then at the end, they like bring you into this big room, and the pastor's there on the the thing like leading an altar call. And I remember like even growing up with it, I was like, this is weird. But the other one, and this one's way funnier. This is actually put on by the church associated with the college, and they have a haunted house in an abandoned warehouse district down by the railroad tracks. And you pay to go, and it's like 80% a haunted house. It's kind of fun, and I enjoy going even now. I'm like well too old for it because it's cheap and it's fun and it's like a local thing, and it's kind of just fun to people watch. But the last like 20% of it is insane. They basically like after the haunted house, and the last section, weirdly enough, isn't really even a haunted house. It's like a fun house. They've got like, oh, it's a tunnel with like twisting lights and all that. And then they dump you out into like a FEMA tent. And they've got like little dividers everywhere, like cubicles. And they bring you in, and they've brought some like poor 19-year-olds. The Christian college has a mandatory like public service, which is probably overall good. And they force this poor kid to evangelize to a group of 20 people like every 15 minutes. So these kids are so worn out. And it's such a weird thing because you literally are like, you get out of the funhouse, you're ready to go, and then it smash cuts to like a gruesome depiction of the crucifixion. You walk around a corner, and then you're in a FEMA tent full of like 19-year-old, Christian college students who are giving you, this like what's supposed to be a heartwarming story. But probably the most bizarre thing about it is not only is it such an abrupt transition, but these kids, I feel bad for them because they actually have nothing to say at all. So like, I'll never forget, I went once with a couple friends in high school or something. And so this guy's giving us his life story, and his big like come to Jesus moment was, I kid you not, he was like, yeah, I was in high school, and I saw this kid, and I just hated him. I couldn't stand him because he had studs in his jeans. I was like, okay, and then what? He's like, oh no, that's it. I just didn't like him. And I was like, really? That's it? And then he like kind of contorted that into, and that's why you need Jesus. And I'm like, okay, fair enough. Like that's not a good thing, but I don't know if this was your road to Damascus moment, right? Like you were mildly rude to someone, like, this is the end of the world. But I could tell he was just like, look, I got to get through this. I've been doing this like all night. I'm like, all right, fair enough, man. But that's probably my most direct experience with like revivals or scaring the Jesus into you, is those like very elaborate, theatrical events. They're like large scale, low church morality plays, but with like people wearing Freddy Krueger masks.
And I'm sure there's a couple churches near me. They do. They probably do something similar. They've got more of the light show, and they probably do more revivals than I'm aware of. But it's
wait. Actually, so I'm so sorry, man. That just dislodged a memory because I didn't grow up in these, and so I've kind of forgotten a lot of it because I was a pretty young kid. But one of my grandparents' first churches, sorry, and the light show thing brought it up. They had a like a trunk or treat where a lot of like hardcore Baptists don't believe in Halloween, right? Because it's satanic or evil or whatever. Again, I didn't grow up like that. I don't quite get it. But that's my summary of it from what I can tell. But so they had a trunk or treat, right? And of course they have a church service afterwards. So everyone, the trunk or treat part is essentially you go trick or treating in the church parking lot. Everyone pulls up with their trucks or whatever and has candy in the back, which seems to me a distinction without a difference, if I'm going to be perfectly honest, because you're still supposed to dress up. But again, I'm a guest in this tradition, so I'm not gonna badmouth them. But then they have a church service or whatever, and they have a coffin on stage. And in the middle of the service, and I think it was about Lazarus or something, someone busts out of the coffin, raised, like theatrically raised from the dead. And I was sitting in the front, just like pounding Snickers. I remember looking around and like, what in the world is going on? But hey, they gave me enough candy, so I wasn't going to complain.
Yeah, that's the Baptist mentality. See, they knew you weren't a Baptist because you were sitting in the front row. All Baptists sit in the back, as far away from the pew as or far away from the pulpit as possible.
Yeah, fair enough. Fair enough. One of the other weird things about it is, so again, not being Baptist but living in a heavily Baptist area. There's actually bizarre restrictions on drinking, like even within the city. So, for instance, right, like it's actually very difficult to get a liquor license in my town. A lot of places will basically be like have their funding denied because certain places have large contingents of Baptists around. So that's really odd. But one of the other odd things is that there is no real bar culture, which is probably a positive, right? But there is a huge coffee culture. So in my relatively small hometown in the middle of nowhere, it's like what 70,000 people, so a small city, I guess technically. But there's like really 2 bars, but dozens of coffee shops because essentially, right, like if you're a hardcore Baptist, you're not allowed to drink. So it's like taking that same slot socially. So I'm curious, like, I don't know was there that same like level of cultural influence? Like, even if it's different, I'm just curious.
Yeah, well, I mean, I can tell you there used to be a bar on the county line going out back towards a military base. I mean, there's a couple of those, but as far as coffee houses, I mean, this is telling all, but I mean, I come from a town that's 1,000 people max. I mean,
Okay, so fair enough, right? It is a different.
yeah, but other than that, I mean, yeah, I can definitely tell you there is no bar culture here. There is there the closest thing you can get. I mean, they sell it in grocery stores, but I don't know if you guys have this in Virginia, but we have a blue law here that says you can't sell alcohol before noon on Sundays of any sort.
Yeah, we don't have that directly. I know there are still some dry counties in my state, or at least I think there are, but it's pretty much the minority. Virginia as does North Carolina, has a proud tradition of alcoholism and bootleggers. So I think that even the religion couldn't get the alcohol out of my state.
No,
In all the most extreme examples, right?
yeah, I've had my fair share of moonshine, to say the least.
It's culture, right? It is
Yeah.
the culture. It's interesting too because I will say, like, not being Baptist. I was even talking to my roommate about this morning. It does create a very positive environment because I'll put it this way, right? Like, I probably agree with like the super like hardcore mega church Baptists on like 50% of things. You know what? And like fair enough. Like we don't like about those other things we disagree. Like it's not really that much of a problem. But it serves two purposes. Which one, that 50% is quite a lot, and it's a lot of important stuff, right? Like it's a big focus on security, a big focus on like to use it overused phrase, like family values. But another big one, and this cannot be stressed enough, is it keeps undesirables out of town. Like it keeps the kind of like especially in a state like Virginia, which is very highly divided north to south, is that once you have a reputation for being like one of the Baptist or the fundamentalist areas, it keeps out the undesirables, and it is wonderful. So you know what? Like as much as I kind of make fun of the some of the other denominations, because let's be honest, some of it's a little bit silly, right? Like I'm sorry, you bring a coffin and someone pops out of it like like the Undertaker or something. Like yeah, it's a little funny. Like you got to give me that. But like I'm not going to deny that I am grateful for it because it creates a very definite culture that people want to avoid, and I'm happy that they want to avoid it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I can definitely tell you from experience, I can probably name on one hand how many quote undesirables I had in my town that I knew. I mean, if it doesn't keep them away, it keeps them very, very quiet about many issues that they might seek to impose. I mean, I used to, for an example, I mean, there are these old men who run the that the are the town commissioners and that run the community board, and I used to hate them because when I was 16, they we found out like there's a Walmart coming to town. And as a 16-year-old, you're like, oh my God, yeah, that's so cool. I get to hang there with all my friends, etc. And then I found out the town board voted it down like unanimously. And
Based.
I was heartbroken at the time. But now as I come see, I'm like, wow, those guys actually are is what's keeping the town like actually semi-normal. I mean, we've got several housing projects where let's just say, as my grandmother would say, colored town folk stay. That's pretty much it. I mean, this town's pretty much 60-70% white, and the rest of them are illegal immigrants and black folk.
Well, and it's nice too because I, to me, like any type of like any type of town that kind of like starts to get to a certain size, right? Like you start to get like imports, and I even see it now because like I live in a pretty small but nice apartment complex, right? And even then, like I can tell there are a few like true out of staters or out of towners, right? Like there's a guy, and I almost want to take a photo of this guy's car because he has the most sincerely embarrassing collection of bumper stickers I've ever seen. Like it's like a defend BIPOC with an AR-15, like a BDSM sticker, and like a rainbow flag. And every time I'm like, what are you doing, man? But the nice thing is that like that's very definitively not approved of. And
Mm.
so like admittedly, like no one's gonna like key his car or anything, but that's very much like not acceptable. And so it's nice that even in a place where like, yeah, okay, it's unfortunate, like there are a few rainbow flags downtown, but it is also very much not the widely accepted culture. And so as someone who's lived, and look, like I know you're going to school, I'm not asking you to dox yourself or anything, but like as someone who's lived in college towns, and at least personally, like I've lived in most of the major cities in my state, and I think that it's easy to kind of fall into that trap. Like you said, like when you're 16 or something, you're like, oh, like I want to go to the big city, like I want all the stuff, but you kind of realize like, wait a minute, like, okay, fair enough, like yeah, you're getting opportunity to eat places, you're getting an opportunity to to buy stuff more easily, but that comes with a cost, a very definitive cost, and I think it's all too easy to kind of discount culture, which I think is the most important thing when it comes to where you live, for the economic stuff. And look, like you need a job. Like I'm currently in the process of trying to find a job, and I realize it's more difficult because I didn't want to move to a big city. But I think that it's entirely too easy to essentially fall for the like line go up meme, of like, oh, like go to the big city, get a job. And look, like people need jobs, people need to make money. I'm not denying that, right? But that's kind of a secondary thing past a certain point, right? Like you need enough money to survive. But like how much of a pay cut are you willing to take to live among people with your values? And I think that that's something people need to address pretty explicitly.
Yeah, most definitely. I'll tell you, I live about an hour away from the coast in North Carolina, and I went to school on the coast at the college. They affectionately, as part of the UNC school system, they affectionately call it UNC White because I mean a majority of the population are white,
Is
and
that Wilmington? Or sorry, I'm not
yeah,
asking you to dock
no,
yourself.
no, no, you're good. It is Wilmington.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, even only having like a passing familiarity with the state schools, yeah, I guess.
Yeah, it's Wilmington. I mean, whatever multiracial students we get in are are for the basketball team. Um, but yeah, it is very different because I lived in Wilmington for a couple years, school, and got an apartment, and then I finally moved back home while I finish up my school. But yeah, I also work in a lot of stores. I travel around to most stores in like the Wilmington area to stock shelves for a gay MNC corporation. Um, I stock Oreos, and so we've just recently got the Pride Oreos out from last month. They're still trying to sell down, so that's fun. But yeah, I see in like there's the higher end areas that have like a Harris Teeter or a Publix or even a Food Line, or the Costco, and you will see a higher caliber of people, as mean as that may sound, as opposed to when you go to a Walmart and they just and everyone and their mother can go in their pajamas with their 5 children, and yeah.
Well, that's the funny thing is like I don't remember it. Was it a blog or a Facebook? I can't remember. With that people of Walmart, like internet.
Yeah, it
Uh,
was a Facebook.
yeah, that's what it was. Yeah. Again, I never had a Facebook, so I only saw it secondhand. But I think it's easy for people to just kind of dismiss that. That is not only very much real, but it is worse than you can imagine.
Yep.
Like I don't know how much I can say this, but I have actually seen people, uh, shall we say, relieving themselves in Walmart before in like a
Mm.
relatively nice area,
Hmm.
and it's funny, right? Because I moved out of I just moved out of the state capital, Richmond, which is a blasted hellhole, even more so than it used to be. But it's funny because I think just naturally, right, like by like my constitution, I'm kind of just more of a live and let live guy. Like I'm never gonna be the guy to cause problems. But it took me like a month and a half of living there, and I was like, send in the hounds. I don't care. Judge Dredd, just get it out. Like I want clubs, I want riot shields. Just get these people out. And Walmart's one of those places that it brings out the inner authoritarian in me. Where after a few minutes, I'm like, I don't know what the problem is, but to quote Hoppe, these people need to be physically removed.
Uh, and see, that's the thing about living in the South. You will see, and I don't know how it is up north. I have my woman, she's from up north, but they have a Walmart up there, but I'm not sure the degree to which it is similar. But in the South, you will get a vast swathe, as Mr. Fahrenheit said. You will see the poor blacks and the rich blacks. You will see the poor whites and the rich whites around here. It's not just the worst and the best. It's not just one or the other. It's usually both.
Yeah, no, and that's the other thing I think people don't realize is how like for all of the racial issues in the South, which, look, I'm not gonna pave over those, right? Like those are very real. It's also like these people were very much like living on top of each other, so to speak, right? Like I was even like I don't go shopping that often, but I was out this morning, grabbing some things for my roommate, and like we were waiting in line, just kind of chatting, and there's kind of a like me and him are very much like like white upper middle class kids, right? Like we're both working or about to work like white collar jobs, right? The lady behind us is some like toothless, rougher looking white lady who's again super nice. Then there's like a Chris Chan impersonator behind her, and this like 6'4" black guy in dreads, and we're all just like talking, carrying on. Because and look, don't get me wrong, like I'm not trying to like I'm not don't read into this too much, right? But like I think people make out that there's a bigger difference between general Southern culture and Black culture because they are kind of the same at root. You know what I
Mm.
mean? Like a lot of the food's the same, a lot of the cultural attitudes towards things like food. And obviously, don't get me wrong, like there are definitive differences that we should probably not discuss on air. But my point is, right? Like I think that people, especially from outside the South, view the South as like apartheid South Africa. You know
Mm.
what I mean? Where it's like different language, different people. It's like German shepherds on every block. But like to be honest, like people are relatively normal, especially in the rural South. And
Oh
like
yeah.
fair enough, right? Like there may be some harsh words whispered under your breath, but for the most part, rather, people are relatively respectful. And if you're not looking to start anything, there generally won't be anything, at least in my experience, right?
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, I had a conversation the other day. I was in another very small town, maybe 1,500 people. Um, I had a very nice conversation with an or not elderly, middle-aged black man who was very distressed about the way the country was going, saying we're better than this. Not just saying blacks or whites, or whatever, but we as Americans are better than this. And I can, that conversation's been replicated with lower class whites, middle income whites around here, poor blacks. I mean, it doesn't really matter. I mean, the cultures are very, they're intractably linked, but they have diverged somewhat in aspects like you mentioned. But Yeah, it is. I don't know. Maybe that's still some of my old conservative leanings, but there are there is that there is that thing of it is a little bit of poor people can pretty much understand each other, especially in rural areas, whereas some more uppity people, I suppose you'd be called, um, have a harder time mixing with other people that aren't like them.
Well, it's funny too because I was just down in Louisiana visiting some friends, and again, I won't mention who because they don't want people to know where they live. But it was interesting, right? Because look, like Virginia is definitely the South, but it's kind of the tip of it. You know what I mean? The kind of the line runs roughly through the state. People
Mm.
can decide where exactly, right? But it was interesting because going down to Louisiana, which is very much like deep, deep South, and stopping all the way, it was interesting how relatively homogenous the culture is. And Louisiana is probably the most different out of the South, right? Like they've got that weird French Cajun influence. But it's funny because the place I was in, and Louisiana is more like this, you can definitely tell an ethnic difference, right? Because there's the Cajun areas, which are French influenced, and you can tell, the people, how they sound, the last names, and also the architecture. And I was in a more like Anglo American area, right? And it was odd because like it looks completely different, right? Like I'm from the mountains and I was in, swampland, essentially a jungle, right? But the people's different. The people are, relatively like very, very kind and welcoming. And I think that it's a obviously it's my culture, so I'm biased, but it is oddly familiar, right? When you're, 900 miles away from home and you're like, oh, hey, they're advertising for, they've got, in the middle of nowhere on some telephone pole, they've got a, stapled up sign for a revival next week, things like that. So it does kind of feel like home kind of over the whole spread of it, right?
Yeah, yeah, it is a definitely the South, like you said, is a more homogenous culture as a whole. And I recently, like I said, my woman, she's from up in Massachusetts, and we recently had to drive her home because she went to school here out of state. Um, and it's very different seeing Yankee culture and and how far it has deteriorated. Because I went to several little towns. I went to like Plymouth, which was amazing. I loved it. I went to a little place called Rockport. I went to Hyannis, where the Kennedys are from, and pretty much just spent time in small town in New England. And I mean, I can't tell you how many Trump flags I saw and "Let's Go Brandon" flags. I mean, just like within a block of her house. But with that, there were also the new intersectional Ukraine pride flag and um, all of these. And I mean, when I went by the Red Sox stadiums a few years ago, I mean, they had a huge BLM billboard plastered on the side when you went into Boston, and I don't know, it definitely feels like the cities are exerting much more force on the hinterlands than the hinterlands are, regardless of how conservative they may be.
No, that's fair. And I think that it's also, yeah, and I would say similar things about the Northeast, right? That it is odd to kind of drive between the extremes, right? Like Massachusetts is actually a good example, because you go to like the west side of Massachusetts, and it's essentially like, wait a minute, these are the same rednecks. Like I know these people, and you might see a sneaky rebel flag or something, which is always kind of funny. I'm like, wait a minute, you guys, it's appropriation. You guys can't have that.
Speaking of that, my girlfriend, she mentioned that on one of our first dates. She was like, "Yeah, there was this kid that I went to high school with, and he had a huge rebel flag on the back of his truck." And I was like, "Oh, really? Where'd he get that from?"
Yeah, exactly. It's like, all right, let's run some kind of genealogy on that one because I feel like that's not quite fair, man. Yeah,
Oh, but
that is funny, right?
yeah,
It has been interesting too because North Carolina is another battleground state, right? Like y'all are kind of flipping between red and blue.
yeah, yeah. It's definitely it's very easy to see. There's Raleigh, which is, of course is governed pretty much governed by like that tyrant Cooper. There's Asheville. If you ever get to Asheville and Boone, it's god awful.
Asheville's the weirdest town because it's
Yeah.
like half gross, crunchy hippies, and the other half is Billy Graham. and there's nothing in between. And it's the
Yep.
weirdest combination. It's like you stuck two completely separate cultures on top of each other. And it's always struck me as a very odd place.
Yes, it is. I mean, if you go to like the Mass General store or something, it's nice. I mean, you can get some old timey candy, watch one of those pianos. You can put the quarter in and it'll play by itself and stuff like that. But I mean, on the other side of town, there's these bars where, I mean, they'll make you wear a mask to get in, show your vax card, and then you have to check all that stuff. But yeah, it's like that. And then there's Wilmington, which is what I'm familiar with, and it's governed by a Greek, Sappho, and he endorsed Bloomberg back in 2020. So he was already
Embarrassing. Like what?
yeah, he
Like
endorsed Bloomberg.
all politics aside, that's just a bad choice. Like,
Yeah,
what were you thinking, man?
yeah. Invited Bloomberg out there, spoke at a high school, and was like, "This is going to be the next president. He's the best." Yada yada, whatever. And it's like that. And then I don't know if I don't know how much has been in the news, but anyway, there's this new event coming to light within the last 10 or 15 years called the Wilmington Massacre of 1892. Have you heard of it, Mr. Burden?
No, I have not, and I have a feeling there's a reason I haven't heard of it.
There is. Post Reconstruction, people like to say that Wilmington was just one of the most model mixed race communities ever. There were all these black newspapers and black businessmen. There was this black there was a black alderman or something like that. Anyway, the story that's generally told now is that the racist, white supremacist Democrats
Wait,
got in.
you added a word you weren't supposed to. You're supposed to hide that part. Remember?
Oh yes. They come in and they kill 10 or 15 black people and move, and like the rest of them go hide in the swamps for like a couple weeks. But now on UNCW's campus, there is a huge memorial to it, to all the lives lost, of 20 people, mind you. But and there's these huge like signs on, if you go to the black part of town, and which is like have most of downtown in Wilmington, there'll be these signs like, it's almost like the Black Israelites, because they'll say they were the original Cape Fear Indians and stuff like that with the Pan-African colors.
Huh? That's an odd one, but
Yeah.
all right, fair enough. That's one of those things where it's like the Black Hebrew Israelites. They're insane, but I'll put it this way: they're kind of funnier than like just your average shitlib. So at least personally, I'm like, well, okay. If I had to pick one, like, Shakespeare being black and Henry VIII being black, like, it's stupid, but I mean, at least it's like something to talk about. You know what I mean? Like the stuff you're talking about, where it's like this, like, this admittedly probably unpleasant event from years ago that we kind of dug out to just use as like a club to beat our enemies with. Like that's kind of boring. And then it's like, well, okay, well, I guess I'm not exactly going to support it. So that puts me in a complicated position. But when it's something like Henry VIII was black, it's like, all right, well, at least you're coming up with something.
Yeah, I can get behind it. I mean, like, there's the video that goes around. There's this huge, there's like these 6'4" black Israelites, and
This is from the Louis Theroux one, isn't it? The one where it's like undoubtedly black.
No. It's the one where it's these white guys, these white people are passing in New York, and the black guys are like, "Boo hoo! The Holocaust happened," and I can't remember the entire spiel, but it was funny. And there's just these soy-looking white guys like, "Oh my God, you can't say that!" And he's like, "Boo hoo! The Holocaust! I wish it happened."
That's what I'm saying. Where it's like, you gotta admit, these guys are kind of funny. Like, is it that a nice thing to say? No. Is it funny? Yes. I'm not going to deny that. I feel the same way, and I'm not super integrated with this community, right? But like, if you're even vaguely familiar with the Hotep community,
no, I'm not actually.
Oh, so this is one of them's been on Rogan, and I can't remember, but essentially they're like half Black Hebrew Israelites, half like Black separatists. But essentially, their point is, I guess those are both the same. Okay, never mind. That Venn diagram didn't work out how I meant it to. But basically, what they're, and again, like I'm not a scholar on these guys, so I might have gotten a lot of this wrong. But essentially, what their point is like, look, like we have not been, as Black people, well served by, like essentially like they would say like white American politics. Like this is like a poisonous, like vampiric relationship. So we need to just do our own thing and basically like, accept responsibility and basically like become our own community and like stand up for ourselves and not take handouts. So fair enough. Now they mix that with a bunch of like kooky Yakub stuff, the like big brain
Oh,
scientist
oh,
who invented
I
white
love
people.
Yakub.
I do too. I think it's like the funniest thing in the world. And so that, look, don't get me wrong. Now that part is retarded. I'm just gonna go ahead and say it. Now, admittedly, the other part, I'm like, okay, fair enough. That there's something to be said there. And so I'm willing to just kind of hold my tongue for the
Hmm.
retarded part. If it's like, and then the other part is like, yeah. So anyway, Yakub made white people to oppress us, so we should stop taking government handouts and make our own communities. I'm like, all right, I'll just pass on the first part and we'll go with the second part and just not argue about it. You know what I mean?
Yeah, yeah. It is the lineage of the Malcolm X and the Marcus Garvey stuff that was pretty much pushed out of politics because of the Lincolnites and stuff like that.
Well, yeah, and it like people kind of forget that MLK was basically a laughing stock by the time that he got taken out. And
Yeah.
again, like by no means endorses what happened to him. Like that's not my point at all. But like I think that there was a conscious effort to kind of, and you see this right even with like Con Inc. like fetishizing MLK, where there was basically this like concentrated effort to essentially fold that rage back into the system, and essentially try to like cast off all the bad things as oh, that was with that crazy Malcolm X guy. And again, I'm going to go ahead and say Malcolm X would not like me for a variety of reasons, one of which that I'm essentially a cave person when it comes to skin tone. But I don't know, there was something to be said for the fact that like providing community policing, like getting armed and essentially running things for yourself. Like again, like I understand like there are many reasons we would butt heads, but I feel like that's at least a slightly more positive step, essentially being like, okay, like, free ourselves from kind of like the vampiric, like force of the GAE. And so I don't think that that'll, at least in mass, work until some things
Yeah,
change.
and
But it still seems like a positive move for, those people, right? Because again, they're not my people, they're not my community, but, just from like a Christian perspective, like I don't want, like they live in my country, right? I don't want them to be doing poorly.
well, that's the thing. I think that's a lot of that's what a lot of further people on the right, I suppose. They want they want the abortion stuff so so the black people can not reproduce at a significant rate and stuff. And that's the thing. I don't want that. I just I want them to do well, and quite frankly, not to tear up a community.
Well, and I feel the same thing. And this is the other part where it's like I just can't get around it. Like obviously I recognize the fact that just by pure numbers alone, right? Like the black community in America is a drain on resources. That's not a moral claim, that's just an objective financial one. But there's also something to be said for the fact that like they're not doing well. You know what I mean? It's not like this, they're all like living in palatial estates, like lording over us. And look, I understand, right? Like there's ways to game the welfare system. But also, like, if you look at, and look, like I lived in Richmond, like my fiance worked at, one of the worst schools in America, right? So like I'm familiar with these families, right? Through her and through, meeting people, right? It's not a good existence. Like
No.
it's not something you'd want. And so fair enough. You're like, well, okay, well, like that's a chosen existence. So all right, I get that. But it's not conditions we would wish on anyone, And so like, okay, I realize within the bounded context of this specific person, they did kind of choose it. Fair enough, right? Like I'm ceding that point. But also like, I think we can, and I'm not, again, I'm going to stay vague on this, and I'm not like trying to like point to some shadowy cabal of they, but essentially like there's a huge incentive structure to create essentially like a client class, but the problem is even the client class, like they're getting something out of it, but they're not necessarily doing hot, like this isn't like they aren't. And so I think there's a lot of misdirected anger and rage, if that makes sense.
Yeah. They are certainly not living it up just because they're on the welfare system. I mean, Christ, I can go by many of these people's houses, and I mean they're pretty much in disrepair. I mean, there's stuff all in the yard, and trash, and Granted, there
Well,
are some.
right. And it
Yeah.
reminds me, it's like there is like a kind of like it's like an abused spouse. You know what I mean? Like they keep coming back for essentially the thing that's like poisoning them to a certain extent. And look, I realize like maybe that relationship isn't broken until the money runs out. Like there's just no way to do it because human nature being what it is. Fair enough, right? But I think that even a small effort to kind of decouple people from that and kind of soften the blow is probably positive.
Yeah. Most definitely. I can't add anything else to that because that was perfect. That was perfect summation.
Well, fair enough, man. So one of the other things, and this is a complete, 180-degree change of topic, which considering what we've been talking about is probably good for the future of my channel, right? Uh, is you wanted to talk about like Zoomer political extremism. So what are your thoughts on that?
Well, coming to you as a Zoomer, I can pretty much tell you I held almost every position on the right, not simultaneously, obviously, but I mean, as I said, I grew up in a fairly conservative household. Not don't want to talk about it too much, but it was more just kind of unspoken, the silent majority kind of thing that Nixon might say. But it was pretty much that. Didn't really watch Fox News or listen to Rush or Jerry Falwell or something. But it was pretty much that for you know first half of my life, and then I get to high school, and one of the assistant teachers, he hands me one of Ron Paul's books. I think it was this Dictionary of the American Economics or something. So I read through that and I'm like, wow, this is pretty cool. And so then I guess at that point I consider myself some like a Ron Paul libertarian. Then I go through a couple more years in high school, still pretty much libertarian, going through an agnostic phase, and eventually hit Ayn Rand. And so
Oh,
then
I'm sorry. That's a dark place to be.
oh my God, you have no idea. It was I had to read through the Fountainhead for one of my classes, and I was like, "Whoa, this makes sense." And being that retard, I was like, "I'm an objectivist now." And I never took the full black pill of going full scale atheist. That was probably close, but I did that for a few years. Pretty much an objectivist for a year or two. Then um, then I got out of a relationship with a Christian socialist woman, and
You
then
might have to clarify that sentence a little more. So what's the story on that? And I'm not trying to like get into your personal life, but
no,
Christian
no,
socialist. So like, is that just
yeah,
what it sounds like? Those two adjectives or those two describe or
kind of.
adjectives
So
together?
she grew up Baptist as well, and that was my first girlfriend. So I stayed with her for 3 years. God knows why, but I was a very weak man. That was why. But I did that for an extended period of time, and I just slowly found out that the Christian aspect of her identity was a veneer so that she could basically advance socialist policies because she was happy to go on mission works to South Africa and stuff, but would pretty much um, shout about kill the rich and redistribute all the wealth on Facebook in her spare time. Um, so that probably didn't help my political extremism at that point. Um, so after that, got through the Ayn Rand phase, found a couple things wrong with that. Then I go through the theocrat monarchist phase, and that was a few years ago. And go through all that, read some of the literature here and there, not much, but I mean, just pretty much saying like God should be in charge of everything, and we need a Baptist theocrat in office and all that stuff. And um, in between there somewhat pretty much hit the normicon phase, neocon, and then I couldn't tell you where I'm at now. To be quite honest with you, it's pretty much all over the place still. I mean,
Well, so and I'm not. So I'm 23 right now, right?
hmm,
So also a Zoomer. I'm kind of the older end of it, and it's interesting because I had somewhat similar experience. I think there's kind of two things motivating the like Zoomer expression of political extremism, which is one of it that's just like we kind of are radically like deracinated, right? Like there's no main culture,
hmm,
and I think especially the thing is that we kind of there's been and maybe we're seeing one form, right? But there's been no satisfying right. Like Obama broke the old right. Trump kind of not old right, the last, like the neocons. Maybe Trump's kind of rebuilt it into something new. But my point is not necessarily that. My point is that like there hasn't been a good slot for right wingers, and especially like higher IQ right wingers. I don't mean that like we're all geniuses. I just mean like people who are really interested, for whom like Ben Shapiro style, like it just doesn't sit well. And so I think that it's interesting because a lot of people have gone through that libertarian stage. I think that that's kind of like the first port of call for, okay, like the Daily Wire conservatism, that doesn't make sense. So I guess maybe I just need to go further along the economic axis. Like, okay, maybe that's where the problem is. We need more, more capitalism, more free markets. And I think that that suffices for at least some people. But at least for me, and it sounds like for you, like you kind of sit there for a while and you're like, this doesn't work. Like, why have you guys been around since the 70s and you haven't won anything? You know what I mean? Well, not only have you not won anything, but like none of the people involved in this are like impressive or interesting people. They're kind of all losers, and you look around and you're like, well, why? And there's always these kind of like, even within the libertarian movement, there are these like big questions that just never get touched, right? Because realistically, you're kind of in the same like bubble, if that makes sense. Like you're kind of within the same like set of assumptions, just more so. So like one of the things that I used to hear on the libertarian circle is like, oh, we're more left than the left and more right than the right. And you're like, well, kind of, guys. But like realistically, you're just kind of within the same, I guess, within the same tent,
Yeah.
And so like I think that that's kind of like the last like acceptable-ish stopping point for guys on the right, which is like, oh, like you can go to the libertarian, but like go no further. But I do think that like if you're still like really interested in, I guess, like finding answers that won't hold you for too long. And look, I kind of describe myself in the same position of being like, well, I don't really know where I am now, because at least for me, it's like I feel like I'm too young and too inexperienced to say like, oh, I've got it figured out. But I'm quite sure that like whatever's within the Overton window isn't the answer. And I'm kind of like you, right? Like I'm a right winger by constitution. And so like I'm not quite sure like if you said like, oh, do you think that it's going to be a based integralist future or some kind of like Mormon futurist theocracy? It's like I got nothing. I don't know. I'm probably going to go ahead and say probably not. But again, like I said, I don't know. And so like to me, it's like I think there's a lot of foolishness of kind of like theorizing about what will be done, when we own society. I think it's just kind of stupid. It's not particularly productive. But I do think that there's an interesting conversation to be had, especially if you're humble enough to kind of keep an open mind and not to like make dramatic proclamations as a college student who's never like had a job or like, you know what I mean? And I think that because it sounds like you and I are in roughly similar positions, right? But there's a lot of like lofty things said by people with nothing to back it up,
Yeah, going back to the original point that why Zoomers do this is because, there is no, like you said, there is no true right-wing culture. Any vestige of it was killed probably first with Reagan, especially after Nixon got the boot, and then especially with Obama just decimating everything. Everyone, all Zoomers are pretty much listless. I mean, it's not just on the right as well. You'll see, I mean, we were talking before the show about these Wiccan women who will listen to Metallica and cast spells on the Taliban for whatever reason. It's on all sides, and we are struggling to find that culture. And like you said, it is forming, but it's not in opposition to what came before. I think it's its own thing in itself, in and of itself.
No, that's fair. And I think that it is kind of difficult to kind of create a culture from scratch. And I think that there's a lot being done to kind of, I guess, like poke out the limits of like, well, okay, what is this group of thought? Like, what's the canon? And I know that Sam Batch will get on me for using that word because it's a new left word, but the point stands, right? Like there is kind of this like casting around for new ideas, because I think that it's kind of hard to look at everything and look like the right in America is on like essentially like almost 100-year losing streak.
Mm-hmm.
Like really like after the old right got kind of blown out, we've just been losing and like shifting ground and continually just affirming the victories of our enemies, right? And so if you look at that as a problem, which I do, and I assume you do, it's kind of like, well, okay, like if we want a solution, we're going to have to look for something else, because obviously the playbook we've been working with is not functioning, right? Like the idea of like, oh, well, we'll just do, well, I know what we'll do this time. We'll do socially conservative, economically liberal again. It's like, well, okay, well, if it hasn't worked once, it hasn't worked twice. Like if any other strategy was on a 100-year losing streak, you kind of look around and say like, okay, maybe it's time to try something else. And I think we're still kind of in that process of trying to figure out, well, what is the thing to try? And I think that there's a lot of like reasonable takes. Like I know my friend Oros is, essentially like building parallel institutions, trying to get people to move together. And fair enough, maybe that's it. And I guess at least for me currently, I'm kind of like looking around and like, you could probably say I'm extremist, right? Like just judging off the things that we've said in this interview alone. But it's hard for me at least, because I think there is that feeling that widely like the system is kind of falling apart, but it's difficult to say what comes next,
Yeah, Mike from Imperium Press, he recently published a list of 10 books that you should read and to be on the DR, as he said.
Oh, I haven't seen that yet.
And most of them I've never really heard of. Most of them are pretty. Oh, it's very good. I think some of them are books he's published, obviously, but one's Coriolanus from Shakespeare, one's like a dictionary of Indo-European words, a couple other older texts, Coulange, The Ancient City. But the one that really caught my eye, because I had to read it for college, was Ibn Khaldun's Al-Muqaddimah, which is an Arabic word for the beginning or the introduction. And he did this in the 1400s, way before Spengler and Yaki and all that. Pretty much setting out that the world was cyclical, and that every civilization basically had a four generational time scale before it fell. Because in that time period, in North Africa, pretty much kingdoms would rise and fall within basically 100 years, and you could pretty much, if you were old enough, you could pretty much watch a new generation come in from the wasteland. And so that was basically what it was. It was the wasteland. The desert nomads come in and destroy the old corpulent system, and the next generation are the sons. They might have been raised in the desert, and they're still attached to their fathers, but they start taking on a few of the ideas of the city. Third generation, less removed from their grandfathers. They don't know the struggle, so they start taking on more. Fourth generation, completely removed, and they'll fall to the next desert invader, and so on and so forth until it happens. And Mike from Imperium Press seems to believe that we're probably on the outside. We're going to be the barbarians on the outside who will take the next civilization. But I don't know. Maybe we're just not in the Constitution. We don't have the Constitution yet. I'm certainly not in a position to fight at this moment. I could be in a few years, but I don't know. I think it will take a lot more to get ready for something like that if we are to be those people.
No, that's fair. And it's interesting because I kind of vacillate on this point between thinking like, okay, like maybe there's enough impressive people here to be some kind of counter elite. And on the other end, just looking at it, and it's like, okay, I feel like people kind of view like collapse in this very odd, like Mad Max version, where it's like all of a sudden everything explodes and we're wearing like, BDSM gear, strapping on strapping like extra engines onto our like, 70s muscle cars. Right. But to me at least, like, and maybe I'm wrong, like I kind of look at something like the collapse of the Soviet Union and Russia, and it's like, look, things got bad in Russia for a long time, and they're honestly, they're still not great. Now they're better, they're a lot better, but to me, it's like I think that it might be a little bit optimistic to assume, like you and I will have cabinet positions and government too, right?
Yeah, that's. I think it's great to have some optimism in that regard. I mean, don't get me wrong, I want everything gone at this point. I don't want a monarchy anymore because Mr. Fahrenheit has lovingly told people, you're not a German monarchist. You live in North Dakota.
Yeah, that's a good
America's
way to put it,
republic,
right?
and most likely will be for the foreseeable future. But yeah, I don't know where I was going with that. But yeah, I think it is very optimistic for us to think that, like you said, we will be cabinet members. Most likely, will either be some sort of low level serf, or if we happen to make it and live that long, then some sort of low end manager of the barbarian retail store or something.
That's fair. And yeah, it is interesting because to me, it's like I kind of think that we, things might be worse for a lot longer than we'd guess. But again, I guess I am just kind of pessimistic by nature, right? So anyway, man, I'm kind of running out of time. So do you have anything to plug before we wrap things up?
Well, currently I don't make videos. I probably should at some point, but not at the moment. I've got a Twitter that's at Saddam #1. That's about it. Made that on a whim. So
Well, anyway, I really enjoyed talking to you, man. You have an open invitation anytime you want to come back on, and I want you to know everyone can put this on record. I fully support everything and anything Saddam Hussein has ever done, with absolutely no qualifications. So
thank you,
thank
Mr.
you
Burns.
guys very much, and remember, guys.
The global jihad thanks you.
Thank you, Saddam. And remember, guys, keep your head up. The light can't last forever. All right, good night.